Hello and welcome to this video about the Sukhoi 57, Russia's fifth generation fighter jet, designed to rival the American F-22 and F-35 stealth fighters. However, it has faced many development issues. Only around 20 aircraft have been delivered so far, rather than the planned 300. We will also look at the feedback after its deployment against Ukraine. Above all, we will reveal what new leaks of unpublished documents show about ongoing aircraft development problems. What's the actual condition of the Russian Air Force fleet? To understand the Sukhoi 57, we must look back to the 1980s, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics sought an aircraft to counter America's advancing fifth-generation F-22 Raptor. This development is even more crucial for the Soviets, as they lack any stealth aircraft, while the Americans already have the F-117 designed in the 1970s and operational since the early 1980s. Unfortunately for the Soviets, the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics cut off all funding dedicated to the development of the aircraft. And the manufacturer Sukhoi will try to continue working on exploratory projects like the famous Sukhoi 47 with its forward-swept wing, which is particularly effective in dogfights, but it will never go beyond the demonstrator stage. But above all, they will continue this famous fifth-generation aircraft project, which will be called Perspektivny Aviacyjny Kompleks Frontowej Aviacja, starting in 2002. But since the Russian economy is still fragile, they will look for an international partner. They bring India into the program through a partnership signed in 2007. It's a win-win for both partners. India gains advanced technologies to counter China, while Russia secures a partner to finance the aircraft, which would have been hard alone. But India, on its side, already has a few additional requirements, because it already believes at that time that the Russian proposal is not as advanced as what other countries could have offered. In 2007, India began its search for a 4++ generation aircraft, considering the Rafale, Eurofighter, Gripen, MiG-35 and F-18. This gives India a clear sense of what to expect from a Russian fifth-generation aircraft, since it is familiar with Western 4++ generation jets. India will ask Russia to make 43 improvements to the Sukhoi 57 to meet their needs and expectations, with in particular new generation engines rather than the one that was initially planned. This one isn't powerful enough and generates too much heat, attracting missiles. It consumes too much fuel and its maintenance is too heavy. And that's really a red flag that the Indians know well, since they already operate a fleet with Sukhoi 30s in particular, and they know just how much. Maintenance, especially on Soviet engines, is really something that is too heavy compared to international standards. The Indian Air Force also believes the Sukhoi 57's design. It won't be fully stealthy except from the front, so they want changes to reduce its surface area. Radar equivalent, meaning the echo it will return, especially on the sides and at the rear. And it's true that independent studies shown here have analyzed the Sukhoi 57 as stealth. They realize the echo matches or exceeds that of the Rafale, which isn't considered a stealth aircraft, which is obviously not acceptable from the Indian point of view. If they're buying a fifth-generation aircraft, they want it to have stealth characteristics. India also wants to have a cockpit that is modern, up to NATO standards, with modern man-machine interfaces, a heads-up display, and new generation helmet-mounted sights. And here too, you should know that this is a habit for India. Since the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is collapsed, India has consistently upgraded Russian aircraft, mainly adding French and Israeli avionics. For example, on the Indian Sukhoi 30 modernizirowani komercieski indiski, we can mention the integration of Thales head-up displays, French navigation or optronic systems, as well as avionics components. While it is Thales topside helmet sights that equip the Indian Mikoyan Gurevich 29 SS. The Indians are also requesting that the sensors on the Sukhoi 57 be improved, especially with an active electronically scanned array radar. An active electronically scanned array that's more powerful and reliable than the one NIPT Komarov proposed, since its announced detection range is lower than what the Rafale could already offer at that time. And then they want real data fusion, that is between the radar, the infrared sensors and the electronic warfare systems. Everything needs to be fused so that there aren't different tracks piling up on the tactical display. And that's true. It's a specialty that Russia lacks. This was especially noted during the South Korea competition, when the Sukhoi 35 competed against the Eurofighter, against the Rafale and F-15 which South Korea had selected, but the South Koreans said no data fusion was available on the most modern Russian aircraft in this competition. Obviously, that's something that's not acceptable from the Indian point of view. Lastly, India wants the Sukhoi 57 to avoid the maintenance issues seen with the Sukhoi 30 Modernizirowani Komishevski Indiski, which they already use. A more reliable, modular and easy to maintain Sukhoi 57 with less frequent maintenance cycles, making the aircraft more available. So basically what they want is for the Russians to align with Western best practices, and these are not unreasonable demands. The Indians are eager to buy Russian, as their fleet already includes many Soviet and Russian aircraft, but they want to have equipment that is at least up to the performance level that meets the standard for a Western aircraft, and that is superior to the requirements that Russia sets for its own air force. The Sukhoi 57 prototype first flew in January 2010, over 20 years after the project started, and this flight nevertheless marks a symbolic step towards Russia's return to the club of modern fighter jet manufacturers. It is their first stealth aircraft with initial deliveries to the Russian Air Force expected 5 years later. At that time they discussed over 400 aircraft for the two countries and possibly over 1,000 planes with future export contracts that Russia and India, which is a co-partner, hope to secure. However, the aircraft's development isn't progressing well. Already in 2012, the aircraft was 2 years behind schedule, meaning it fell 2 years behind in 2 years, and the costs on their side are going to skyrocket. India will now spend $6 billion, not the planned $5 billion to buy just 144 aircraft instead of the 200 originally expected, so we get fewer planes at a higher cost. And India? She feels disrespected by the Russians, even though she is paying 50% of the plane's development costs. But the Russians only allow them to participate in 15% of the research and development work. But what they want is not only to have a good plane, but also to have local jobs and to acquire a number of technologies they lack up to that point, but things will worsen over time. In 2014, two events will further delay the project. A fire destroyed one of the few prototypes, preventing further test flights needed for the aircraft's development. But most importantly, in 2014, Russia attacked Ukraine and annexed Crimea, which led to international sanctions. It could no longer obtain key composite materials, electronic systems or machine tools from Europe and the United States, all essential for its aircraft production. So Moscow began to look for alternatives, either locally or through third countries. That means it will purchase parts or used equipment via Turkey or other countries. But that takes time, and then it requires new investments or extra costs for the equipment that was imported through these intermediaries. In 2015, multiple Indian reports claimed the Sukhoi 57 fails to meet true fifth-generation fighter standards, while the cost for India's participation alone in the development of the aircraft now exceeds $6 billion. And at the same time, the competition for a fighter jet purchased off the shelf from abroad, it came to a conclusion, and it was the Rafale that won. And this choice will be a real revelation for the Indians, because now they know the true worth of the Rafale and what are the development plans that have been established with an aircraft that is already operational. Additionally, France offers clear industrial compensations. In contrast, the Russians have not met the technical goals for their Sukhoi 57 aircraft. By then, the first operational Sukhoi 57 Woes should already be delivered to the Russian Air Force. But the deliveries have been postponed for another 3 years, and every year the struggle continues, since the Sukhoi 57 project falls almost a year behind schedule and costs an extra $1 billion each year. Now, deliveries to Russia are only expected in 2019, while India must spend $7 billion just on research and development. So now, the Indians are officially starting to question the relevance of the purchase, since the ratio between the actual cost and the operational usefulness of the aircraft is getting worse over time. And to try to save the partnership, at one point they even considered simply starting over from scratch. They ignore the Sukhoi 57 and offer a marginally improved, more stealthy Sukhoi 35. So they're improving the Sukhoi 35 instead of pursuing the Sukhoi 57, which they think has too many issues. The Indians can't accept that, as Russia has already sold the Sukhoi 35 to China. They can't buy something just a bit better than what the Chinese have. They really need something that is truly superior. By late 2017, the Indians learned that Russia would not honor its commitments on the aircraft's operating costs, and that its maintenance would simply make it unaffordable for Indian finances. A bit like what the American F-35 is putting all the customers who had the bad idea to buy it through, by the way, with an hourly flight cost that was supposed to be the same as the F-16 it was meant to replace. That's about $25,000 to $28,000 per flight hour, but it's actually over $40,000, making the plane unaffordable. Well, the Indians realize that they're going to end up in exactly the same situation, and that's obviously something that's not acceptable. And that's one of the new factors that will contribute to pushing India to completely cancel, to abandon the Sukhoi 57. In April 2018, their hundreds of millions in investments became a total loss. Here, the Indians let loose and will reveal all their 2018 plane criticisms. Indian officials say the Sukhoi 57 has design flaws and its engines lag behind Western standards. Its industrialization would not let it reach the claimed level of stealth. It's true that whenever we saw shared images, we always noticed flaws on the aircraft, which is not acceptable for an aircraft that claims to be stealthy. The radar of the Sukhoi 57 is simply considered inadequate. And the problem for Russia is that with India's departure, well, they lose another $5 to $6 billion that was supposed to contribute to the development of the aircraft. But in addition to this loss of funding, logically, you have half as many aircraft to produce and sell, and that means the research and development costs are divided by a smaller number of aircraft, and that greatly increases the unit cost of each aircraft. The Sukhoi 57 engineers will keep working on the aircraft, but delay some key developments, particularly those related to the engines. In the end, a downgraded version will be sent to Russia for a first flight on Christmas Day 2020. And so in 2020, Russia only has a single aircraft, which is of a lower standard than what was originally planned. It doesn't have its engine, it doesn't have all its sensors, whereas in the Russian military programming law for 2016 to 2020, it was planned that they would have 60 aircraft by that deadline, 1 versus 60. So, nevertheless, in an attempt to make its research profitable and attract new clients, Sukhoi will try to create derivatives of the Sukhoi 57 that could interest export customers. First, the S-70 Okhotnik stealth combat drone, unveiled in 2020, is expected to draw interest from India, China and Gulf countries. The next year, in 2021, they introduced the Sukhoi 75, a smaller, single-engine version of the Sukhoi 57. And they hope to export it to the Emirates, to Vietnam, to Argentina and also to Turkey, just to name a few. In both cases, the aircraft used the Sukhoi 57's avionics, sensors, engine and stealth technology. This enables significant savings and provides aircraft with great value for money. However, in 2022, Russia invades Ukraine again with the high-intensity war we've discussed since February 2022. That will further complicate the Sukhoi 57 program and its derivatives. First, because Russia is once again facing new sanctions. It will have even more trouble getting the machines needed to produce its aircraft. But also it's on the operational level that the criticisms are the most significant. Since the small handful of Sukhoi 57s that have already been delivered to the Russian Air Force are conspicuously absent there, we don't see them on the Ukrainian front, even though they're meant to be Russia's spearhead. It's a bit of underperformance and negative publicity from the start of this war. In reality, it's the opposite. It's not just underperformance, but a real disaster. Russian Air Force is losing many fighter jets in combat. Even the United Arab Emirates is pulling its financial support from the Sukhoi 57 in May 2022, when they were the only partner in the development of the aircraft and its derivatives. And Russia will have to wait another 2 years to try to bring its aircraft back into the spotlight, both in Ukraine and by adopting a more aggressive attitude in exports, both for the aircraft and its variants. So, starting from the summer of 2024, does the Sukhoi 57 feel increasingly involved in operations against Ukraine? And so we have images that will start to appear again. Its contribution is modest and accounts for less than 1% of Russian Air Force missions. And even in what the Russians themselves say about it, they explain that the plane takes absolutely no risks since they simply fire very long-range missiles, like the KH-69 cruise missile, which has a range over 400 kilometers. The Russians claim the Sukhoi 57 participated in 3 other mission types, but gave no evidence or images. Notably, air defense attacks are suppressed by firing the Kh-58U missile, which has a 250-kilometer range, or with the firing of the hybrid drone missile munition called the S-71M, and it is supposed to be able to patrol the sky before finding a target and destroying it. And do you also see the public patent that was filed for this munition in 2024, which was the subject of this communication campaign? Since obviously it's not very common to have public patents for the use of new weapons, in this case that's just more public relations. The Russians also say that the Sukhoi 57 is used as an air defense aircraft. That means it will provide air cover for the planes that are actually taking risks. For example, as a Sukhoi 34 nears the front to launch glide bombs, the Sukhoi 57 remains behind to check for any Ukrainian F-16S nearby. But again, it stays very far away, and they themselves don't take any risks. But it's absolutely pointless to use this plane for this type of mission, a stealth aircraft. We can expect that it was actually designed to get closer to the front, to approach enemy defenses, to be able to launch its glide bombs deeper into the Ukrainian depth. And here, the fact of staying in the rear over Russian territory or behind other planes that aren't supposed to be stealthy, once again, operationally, it's more of an underperformance from a communication standpoint. By the way, it's simple. It simply means that Russia doesn't have enough confidence in its aircraft to send it into contested areas, even over their own territory. That is, they really stay farther and farther away. The aim is to prevent the Sukhoi 57 from being shot down, like the Sukhoi 35 by a Ukrainian F-16. The first generation F-16 supplied to Ukraine shot down a Sukhoi 35, which caused a stir, or even approached the Patriots. If they're stealthy, they could get within a few dozen kilometers of Ukrainian air defense. And obviously the Russians don't dare to do it because they know very well that their aircraft isn't as stealthy as they claim. Even with these precautions, this Russian communication operation will collapse. Ukrainian forces hit 1 or 2 Sukhoi 57s on the ground from a long distance, as confirmed by satellite images. And you should know that Russia is dramatically lacking in refueling resources. And so they are forced to position their fighter jets that carry out missions over Ukraine, close to Ukraine, that is less than 600 kilometers from the front. That's well within range of Ukrainian kamikaze drones and long-range missiles. And that's why they managed to hit aircraft that were on the ground. So, to restore the reputation of the aircraft, Russia is going to use the Sukhoi 57 on a mission that, in this case, would be impossible to carry out with another aircraft. By late 2024, will they send the pair? With its S-70 Sukhotnik combat drone, probably to test sensor coordination or to simulate a bombing campaign in real conditions. But the problem is that during this first flight, the drone no longer responds to its pilot's commands and flies straight, heading directly toward Ukraine. And so, to prevent the drone, which contains all the secrets of the Sukhoi 57 from being recovered by the Ukrainians, the Russians make the decision to destroy the Sukhotnik drone with missiles from the Sukhoi 57, as you can see here. And so, that gives the Sukhoi 57 its first aerial victory. Unfortunately, it was still a deliberate friendly fire. But unfortunately for Russia, it doesn't change anything, because this choice, this decision to shoot down their drone, came too late. And the S-70 falls on the Ukrainian side, where it is analyzed in detail. And here you can see the debris, the wreckage of this aircraft, which was recovered on the ground in relatively good condition. It's a real goldmine for Ukraine and its allies. For the aircraft, as the latest technologies on Russian 5th generation aircraft can be analyzed. And so we know, for example, that the drone sensors were able to be recovered and that these infrared detection systems actually used Western components. For the communication modules, again, they used Western components, but above all, they chose systems that are not hardened against jamming, which certainly explains why the S-70 stopped responding to commands and went straight towards Ukraine. It's simply that it was jammed by the Ukrainian electronic warfare systems. Some systems, especially for jamming global positioning system, can reach several tens or even hundreds of kilometers. And so like that, we have total access to all Russian stealth technologies. And we discover that, in fact, it's only made of the simplest materials, which correspond to the first generations of stealth coatings. without the highly sophisticated paints that you can find, for example, in the United States. So we're really, really far from what Russia claims. Even beyond the shape, which the Indians and Ukrainians had already criticized. So obviously, as they usually do, they're going to recover this S-70, they're going to analyze it. And they're used to cutting up Russian planes that are shot down and selling those little pieces as keychains. That's why I have a whole collection behind me. And what did they do with the S-70? You see the S-70, I have a piece of it at home. That means I have the most advanced stealth technology the Russians have, and of course their clients too. That means all the stealth they claimed they could offer with the Sukhoi 57 is obviously reset to zero. So when your opponents have been able to recover your electronics, your sensors, your stealth technologies, obviously the aircraft loses a lot of its appeal. Since everyone, all of Russia's competitors and its clients, will be able to develop countermeasures that will drastically reduce the effectiveness and operational relevance of the Sukhoi 57 and its derivatives. But that's not all. And the nightmare is going to continue, since I'm now coming back to the secret documents that have just leaked. It's August 2025. First, you should know that the world's elite hackers have been attacking Russia since the beginning of the war with a lot of success. For example, like Anonymous, who hacked the Russian space agency Roscosmos's satellite imaging, and who even released internal documents to prove their success. Over 2 million highly confidential documents detailing Russian nuclear deterrence have also been leaked. We can also mention the theft of all the production documents from the aircraft manufacturer Tupolev. Or, last July, the total paralysis of Gaska, which is the largest Russian drone manufacturer. With all servers destroyed, all design information retrieved, and embarrassing details like Chinese cooperation disclosed regarding Russian military operations, documents revealed that since 2013 the Russian Navy has trained to bomb Western European countries, including France. And so among all these hacks, there's an accumulation of leaked documents concerning the Sukhoi 57, which includes new revelations that can be described as embarrassing. If we want to put it nicely, we see that aircraft production still depends on Western systems in 2024-2025, and Russia can't get its equipment due to sanctions. That's likely why the Sukhoi factory delivered just 6 aircraft in 2024 compared to 12 in 2023. These documents also reveal that the equipment Russians can no longer obtain is not only vital for aircraft production, but is also needed to complete several key technological components for the plane. Like the MPPU-50 communication system, which is supposed to provide satellite communication and allow the radar to function properly. And they have the same problem with the 101 KSN targeting system, which they can't finalize or produce. But in this field, in the field of optronics, it's not really a surprise. Because let me remind you that Russia had to integrate a downgraded version of the Damocles pod, the Rafale's pod at the time, to install it on the Sukhoi 34, and that was the only way they found to offer an effective infrared targeting and reconnaissance pod. It was to produce under license something that was inferior and supplied by France. Well, when they could no longer access that technology, they were already far behind at the time. Obviously, things are going badly for them. And all of this, all these difficulties, actually result in the delivery of aircraft that don't have the basic capabilities of any modern fighter jet. I'll repeat this information for you. These documents show, they prove that the Russian army has aircraft that are incomplete, that are unfit for combat, and that they are receiving them, just to allow Sukhoi to try to find export clients in order to finalize and complete this aircraft. And that this choice to send aircraft into combat with planes that are not finished, well, it led to operational underperformance and the loss of this S-70, and therefore all the technologies they had tried to develop. So, obviously that's dramatic, but alongside these operational efforts on the ground and these leaks, well, Russia's still gonna try, because that's how it is. The goal is to sell its plane, which it showcases at many trade shows. Again, this caused underperformance and very negative communication. So, as I told you, the first Sukhoi 57S that were delivered, they showed many flaws in their functions, with visible rivets, with paint that looked like it was finished with a trowel, and with bubbles in the canopy. But Russia claimed at the time that these were only prototypes and that things would be better with the production aircraft. This time, displaying their aircraft at the Zhuhai Air Show in China sparked major backlash. because industrialization still doesn't meet stealth aircraft requirements, and the Chinese have shared a lot of images that openly criticize the aircraft and even point out a very rough assembly and visible screw caps. So after that, we have to admit that it's not very subtle or diplomatic on Russia's part to share, 3 days before the Zhuhai Air Show, articles claiming that the Sukhoi 57 is superior to anything China can produce. So obviously that annoyed the Chinese, and the Chinese simply put the Russians back in their place. They will also attempt to return to India by offering a navalized Sukhoi 57 for the Indian aircraft carrier. But in the end, it's the Rafale that wins the competition. At the Aero India show, the Sukhoi 57 and American F-35 were parked in the same lot. This was also a disadvantage for it, since a lot of newspapers made comparisons that were unfavorable to the Sukhoi 57. And when Russia wanted to offer India its Sukhoi 57 and S-70 duo, well, Indian military personnel simply revealed that the Sukhoi 57 relied on Chinese components, Chinese chips. Which, by the way, is quite something for a plane that's supposed to be sovereign. Western or Chinese components aren't acceptable. Using Chinese components in India, given their competitors or could be at war, still makes them strategic rivals. That completely rules out any local purchase of the Sukhoi 57 by India. And by the way, that's probably why they've increased their interest in the Rafale, with promising news about the Indian Air Force negotiating to buy 112 more Rafales in the coming months. It's not even over. The nightmare doesn't stop. The Sukhoi 57 is coming back from India to return to Russia. When it makes a stopover in Iran, it's going to have engine problems that will force it to stay there for several days. With unsuccessful attempts to take off again, it's forced to land. In short, it's really dramatic. But come on. Let's still look at the positive side now. The glass is half full, well, more like 10% full, since there are also some favorable elements. There are almost two pieces of good news. In December 2024, we first saw a Sukhoi 57 equipped with the correct Isdeli 30 engine. You can tell because it lacks the traditional engine's round shape. It is much flatter, a bit like what we see, for example, on the French Neuron, the French combat drone, or on the F-20. This will partially mask infrared radiation from the nozzles, making them less detectable. Russia says this engine will be fully operational in 2027, giving it supercruise capability, which no Russian aircraft currently has. Supercruise lets you break the sound barrier without afterburners, which generate a lot of heat and use much more fuel. So it would be a leap forward, since all other planes can actually do it, except the Russians. You know, on a Rafale, a Gripen, an Eurofighter, it exists. A fifth or even a modern fourth generation aircraft that doesn't have supercruise, so the Russians say they'll have it in 2027. But the best news, obviously, for Russia and for the Sukhoi 57 is that Algeria signed, at the end of 2024, a $2 billion contract to acquire 14 aircraft. With 6 deliveries scheduled for 2025 and 8 deliveries scheduled for 2026. The problem is here too, it's August 2025 now, and not a single aircraft has been delivered. And Sukhoi has only been able to produce 2 aircraft in the first 4 months of the year. And that means there's yet another slowdown compared to the already slow pace of 2024. And so the official goal of Sukhoi in Russia is to deliver 76 aircraft by 2028. It is totally unrealistic once again, even if they agree to deliver aircraft that would be incomplete. But well, on the Algerian side, we still have to admit that HTR-US is automatically automatic, and it's not related to the quality of the equipment they acquire. Like Israel or Japan, who always make themselves buy American no matter the product. Algeria is the only country that purchased planes Russia designed after the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics fell. They remain the sole export customers for both the Sukhoi 34 and Sukhoi 57. And the craziest thing is that they buy Russian equipment without negotiating, while the other customers of Russian aviation do. Whether discussing India, Brazil, Malaysia or China, they try to get industrial compensation, to create local jobs, to develop sovereign technology, but Algeria doesn't. But on top of that, they keep buying planes even though they're still dissatisfied with the aircraft they're being supplied with. For example, when Algeria had its substandard Mikoyan Gurevich 29S, they exchanged them for derivatives of the Indian Sukhoi 30, which were supposed to be offered at a very favorable price. Meanwhile, the Sukhoi 34S, ordered in 2019 for delivery, by 2025 still haven't arrived. We could also discuss the Sukhoi 35S that Algeria accepted in March 2025, even though these are aircraft that had been refused by Egypt at the end of 2021, simply because they weren't up to standard and they had been very clear about it. The radar was considered obsolete. The Sukhoi 35 is the last 4.5 generation aircraft with a mechanically scanned radar and passive antenna, while others use active antennas. The aircraft's electronic warfare system is considered too weak, the engines have excessive fuel consumption, and both the thermal and acoustic signatures are too high. And it really seems like Algeria is allowing Russia to get rid of these planes that had been rejected by its client, and that had been sitting in parking lots for 5 years now. All this to tell you that the Sukhoi 57 is obviously very, very far from reaching the level of the American F-22. That was the initial ambition of this project. As long as Western countries maintain sanctions against Russia, it's unlikely they'll finalize it. Even if that's true, we can estimate they'd only match current 4++ generation aircraft like the Rafale or Eurofighter. But again, it's not at all certain that they are capable of reaching that level, and even less likely to meet true 5th generation aircraft requirements, this state of being stealthy, having ultra-advanced sensors, or network warfare capabilities. These are exactly the capabilities the Rafale gains with its new radar and the Sandar 5 suite, which I discussed in a dedicated video. And incidentally, even if the Russians managed to achieve all their objectives, the fact that the aircraft's technologies were recovered by Ukraine and therefore by us, that will dramatically reduce the operational capabilities of the Sukhoi when it faces other Western aircraft. So this Provence combat badge that the Russians are trying to stick on their aircraft isn't worth much. Once again, since the aircraft only carries out missions without any real stakes, which could have been accomplished by previous generation aircraft. And it's certainly not the contract with Algeria that's going to change anything, since Algeria buys everything Russian without any competition. On the contrary, for example, Egypt bought J-10S instead of Russian aircraft when it wanted to replace its F-16S last year. So the Sukhoi 57 will never be a 5th generation aircraft, unless Russia resigns itself to turning to the Chinese, who have certainly already developed some of the technologies that Russia lacks. But it really feels like the swan song for us, who will have to survive without exports with the meager local orders from the Russian state. And in the long run, they could certainly end up being swallowed by the Chinese giant, who will clearly be pleased to be able to put Russian engineers to work on their many projects in the fields of aeronautics, space and defense. The Chinese have projects, money and rapidly advancing technology. If it rained, you will find all the sources that were used, including the very recent leaks of Nenes, in the description of this video. And once again, we will continue to talk about aviation, Ukraine and defense on the channel. I'll see you very soon.